Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Talking Point. My name is Fahraaz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Today we are talking, of course, about a book that was released a couple of months ago, Who Will Rule South Africa? Now, with next year's elections on the horizon, the big question is who will be able to take up the majority of the seats within the National Assembly and who will rule from the union buildings. The ANC faces a bit of an internal crisis in terms of leadership, many difficulties that they're going through. And it's kind of like the same with the DA also, with just this past weekend, reports swirling around whether John Steenhuisen will still be around within the Democratic Alliance. But there are many other political parties on the horizon. Coalition governments is the big talk, and what will be happening with regards to that. We see it in the metros, and there's always the big question mark with regards to that. Joining me in studio, I'd like to welcome the co-author of Who Will Rule South Africa. She, of course, wrote the books Balance of Power, a book based on current President Cyril Ramaphosa, and also 8 Days in July. That was, of course, a book written with regards to the riots that happened in July 2021. Gives me great pleasure in welcoming Qaanitah Hunter. Qaanitah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah so much for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. We've been trying to get you into studio, so we're really, really happy that you have made it through. Qaanitah, let's talk about this book.
Yeah.
2024, it's going to be an elections that defines so much. When you sat down with, of course, your fellow co-author, Adrian Basson, a lot of thinking had to go with it. Why this book, and of course, why releasing it now?
Yeah. So the important question that we sought to answer was, is there any hope for South Africa as people grapple with what the difficulties of life in South Africa, the disillusionment around where we are in the state of our politics as a country, and as we look forward to whether South Africa can sustain another 30 years of this democracy. There's a sense of delusionment, there's a sense of disappointment where we are as a country. And it's important to in answering that question as to is there any hope for South Africa, to take a step back and say, okay, where do we come from? What is this political environment that shapes our present? Where are we right now? And what are our options in terms of where we're going to in terms of the politics of South Africa? And so that's why this book sought to not only speak about today, but go all the way back, tracking from 1994, in terms of the ANC majority. Because in understanding big, complex issues like load shedding, or understanding big, complex issues like the decline in the ANC, for example, one has to take a step back and track almost forensically what has developed over this period of time, and then present the reader with options in terms of where this country is headed to, but more importantly, to explain what some of the political developments that have been happening mean for South Africa and its future.
Qaanitah, everyone keeps saying 2024 is our 1994, and I'm talking from a political party perspective. I mean, I can pick up 3 political parties that have mentioned that same slogan. Now, many would say it's a slogan that catches the attention of the youth, but really, is it feasible right now? Because, 30 years into democracy, are we still needing to go back to what had happened in order to make sure you can catch the attention, especially of the young voters today?
So I think the slogan 2024 is our 1994 obviously first started with the Rise Mzansi political party. The EFF has used it, other political formations have used it. But so some people say it's hyperbole, it's exaggeration of the moment because all elections are important. Yes. But I do think that in terms of the message of 2024 is 1994, is our 1994, is 3 things. First, it shows an important time for or a moment in terms of our democracy. So as important as the moment of the sort of the start of our democracy in 1994, 2024 is going to be as important whether our democracy sustains for another 30 years. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is we're on a precipice of change. Like 1994,
Yes.
we had change. There was change from apartheid rule to democracy, and we had one party governance. In 2024, we're moving away from single party dominance in terms of the ANC, and so it's a political change that comes about. So that's the second thing. The third thing is in terms of the youth, as young people were not around in 1994, and therefore it's mobilizing young people to say, as important as it was for young people to vote in 1994, it is that important for you to come out to vote, even though you may not have been around in the first democratic
Elections, yes.
elections. And so I think that we have to understand that 30 years is an important milestone in any democracy. And what we've seen in the African continent is this decline by liberation parties after 30 years in governance and in office. And so what it's important to track whether that similar pattern will unfold in the ANC, and all polls are showing the same thing. And secondly, if you look at the state of South Africa is in an incredibly precarious position in terms of the economy, in terms of governance, in terms of the social fabric of society. And so there is a lot of emphasis on this election as a manifestation of democratic power for people to take back their country, if you like, and take back power by exercising their right to vote.
Qaanitah, when we talk of leadership within South Africa, I think all of us, look at potentially the first democratic elected president, the late Nelson Mandela. We see him as this icon of what South Africa had dreamt of being in 1994, and then, of course, followed up by Thabo Mbeki. Now, both of them had their flaws, but as South Africans, we'd look at two of them as the pure art of leadership within South Africa. Some politicians may argue differently, but the leadership crisis we face right now in South Africa, I mean, there's a big hole in it, isn't there? And as South Africans, we're looking for a leader that can, if not maybe emulate what we've seen in Mandela and Mbeki, but somewhere can steer us away from the crises that we have within this country. In your book, I mean, how important is it that you've addressed maybe that leadership and that hole in leadership needs to be addressed urgently?
Yeah, I think when we track, the Mandela years was the reconciliation years, the foundation building years. The Mbeki years were the years of growth, prosperity. That's, granted that, it was not perfect.
Yes.
But we pinpoint that moment where former President Jacob Zuma won the ANC conference in Polokwane as sort of the tipping point for South Africa, where South Africa, there was regression in many of the advancements that the country had made by that point. So that was 2007, December. And so obviously, a lot has been written about the hollowing out of the criminal justice system and the repurposing and destroying of state institutions. And then obviously the Ramaphosa years came with the euphoria that it came with, where people were desperate for a leader to sort of reverse the damage that was done under the Zuma years. And there is a general sense of disappointment in terms of the pace of reforms, number one. Number two, the fact that there has been regression in other areas. And so I think that it's important to understand that when it comes to the ANC or the sentiment around the ANC, it is not only about the disappointment in the president, because you see it manifest itself. We're seeing the incredible failures at local government level. You see the incredible failures at a provincial level. And so I think what South Africa has realized or coming to realize is that one person can't fix it all. And I think that was the misconception of the Ramaphosa euphoria that had panned out in 2018. When Ramaphosa was elected ANC president and then later president of the country, where there was this sort of misconstrued idea that he could fix it all. And obviously the decline has intensified in the last 5 years or 6 years. And so when you talk about leadership vacuum, I think South Africans are desperately hungry for leadership. But I do think what our book seeks to say is that a single person can't fix all of the problems that South Africa faces.
And that brings to the next question, the role of citizens, because in this democracy that we have, there is a beauty part to it, and the beauty part is that you can make the difference. And we've, of course, seen in the recent IEC voter registration that there's the gap's getting there as to how important is it to vote. And that's the beauty of democracy, isn't it? That as the citizen, there's still a power that we have to make that difference no matter what happens.
Okay, let me point out the situation. South Africa is a participatory democracy. So if you ask the question, if you ask me the question, is South Africa a failed state? Should we all pack up and leave?
Yes.
I will ask you the question: do you want it to be a failed state? Because what happens to the future of South Africa is inherently linked to whether or not people want this country to succeed or to fail. And so our relationship with democracy has to be one where we are active and participating within this democracy, because it survives and thrives based on people's participation and making it work. What we have seen over the last decade or two has been a growing sense of outsourcing all areas of our life, of politics, to politicians. And so what does that mean? Is saying simply we vote, and we're seeing a lot of more people not voting, and sort of waiting for politicians who've proven to be self-interested over and over and over again to come up with the solutions themselves. And so, yes, while we know that politics has a devastating consequence on life in South Africa, and this bad politics can affect the trajectory of the country, what we're also trying to make the case now is that whether this democracy sustains another 30 years is entirely dependent on whether or not people want it to. And so people have to show up to vote. People have to be active and participatory in local government, because we are living the horrors of the failures in the metros, in the smaller municipalities. And so how we look at the future of South Africa is beyond of, what are they not doing versus what I can do. And so that shift in that dimension shift is so important, in the sense that we've seen it. You mentioned the July unrest, for example. That is a prime example of waiting for people who were actual engineers in a crisis that affected so many people, affected the economy so adversely, to be the saviors that saved the day. And so the idea then is this passive acceptance of it is what it is, or just sort of not understanding our role as citizens and our participation is something that is going to cost us in the long run. And it definitely affects that simple question: is there any hope for South Africa? Do you want there to be any hope for South Africa?
Definitely. Well, after the break, the ANC, 29 years of rule. The question is, does it come to an abrupt end, or do they still have a part to play come next year in terms of maintaining that power? Do stay tuned with my conversation with Qaanitah Hunter. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm in conversation with Qaanitah Hunter, co-author of the book, Who Will Rule South Africa? Qaanitah, I remember, and of course, as your role of assistant editor in News 24, you once said that President Cyril Ramaphosa came in with this perception of being the anti-corruption crusader. Of course, when he came into power, various things have happened, COVID-19 being one of them. As South Africans looking at him right now, it's been a bit disappointing, hasn't it? That 5 years into him being the presidency, it's kind of like the same that we saw during the state capture years, or even worse. I mean, your assessment of President Cyril Ramaphosa since 2018?
I think that so like we mentioned earlier, there was this sort of euphoria, this excitement, this hyper expectation that he will fix it all. But I think that it is incorrect, and I must say it up front, to say nothing has happened in the last 5 years. I think there has been some green shoots. There has been reform at SARS, for example. There has been an effort to rebuild confidence in the criminal justice system, etc. I think what characterizes the disappointment of the public over the last 6 years has been this tardiness that has been President Cyril Ramaphosa's approach to leadership, the delay in making decisive decisions, in arresting problems, in arresting the decline, in a way that leads to meaningful impact. And so, yes, in certain elements, for example, in local government, for example, the right words were used, the focus was there, or the intention was there, but the actual consequences and the resolve, the political resolve to actually fix certain areas, whether it's freight logistics, for example, in Transnet, whether it is fixing the mess at ESCOM, the political grit that it ought to have taken to fix some of these problems. One does not expect all of them to have been fixed in 5 or 6 years, but that was lacking, and I think that has led to that disappointment in Ramaphosa and then in the ANC. The fact that Ramaphosa had to constantly put the party before the country is something that people will punish the ANC for. And I think another part of this disappointment is the president reneging on his own commitments. He promised to be the anti-corruption guy. We didn't make that up. He promised to hold his executive accountable by, for example, having performance agreements with ministers, of which he's now refused to make that public. He had promised to cut the size of executive. That was his election message, and we obviously see a bloated executive. And so, similarly, in terms of the economy, he was Mr. Economy Man to attract foreign direct investment. The reforms have not been fast enough, and therefore we don't see the foreign direct investment necessary to grow the economy. And we faced a situation where South Africa is flirting with a recession. And so the idea then is to not hold the president accountable against what we expected from him, but about his own promises. And so what we do in this book called Rule South Africa, we unpack, for example, how the president bemoaned the state, the capacity of the state, and numerous times indicated that would be his priority area, that you cannot fix things if you do not fix the capacity of the state. But what the president then did was created parallel structures in the presidency instead of fixing government departments, government entities. So created almost this shadow state within the state that did not yield much if you look at, for example, efforts around gender-based violence or efforts around, he had set up a state-owned entity council, for example. So when you look at all of these initiatives put in place by the president, they were lauded as great ideas, as a man taking action, but they fizzled out because they were placed in a system that's not working.
Yes. And that brings up the question about, state-owned entities, Qaanitah, because, the World Bank said that, look, how the economy in South Africa can go 3 to 5%, but Transnet and ESCOM are holding back. And, both of them, ESCOM got a bailout again this year, and then Transnet's about to get another bailout, and you're just asking yourself, right, these bailouts are going to happen. Of course, there's certain agreements that are there for it to, to grow, but, the more you look at it, there's those question marks about the SOEs, and the SOEs remain the lifeblood of the South African economy. And as you mentioned, we are tinkering on a potential recession. He's supposed to be this economy man. And I know there's external factors that are happening from an economic perspective, but how much of the macroeconomic policies are hurting South Africa right now, which are just staggering that potential economic growth?
If you have to track the processes in ESCOM, for example, it took months to appoint a CEO, and a permanent CEO is only starting in March. You then had sluggishness in terms of his great promise that of separating ESCOM into 3 different companies. So the intended reforms are all good on paper, but what does that mean against decline, against these SOEs like ESCOM actually getting worse as reforms take slower. So the reforms are not accelerated or implemented at the pace in which the decline is happening. And that's what we saw at Transnet, is that the decline was too quick and the reforms were too slow. And so as a result, you have to take responsibility when you have a situation like the Durban port, where there's just complete and utter mismanagement has effectively, disrupted so many industries, and will contribute to the sluggish state of our economy. And so the idea then is, yes, a president is not engaged in everyday service delivery, but political will and the tone for getting things done are set at the top. And I think what the expectation of this presidency was that there would be this urgency to fix things, to get things done. And so you saw the sluggishness in even in the priority areas that the president had outlined. And so imagine, other areas, or imagine, for example, what we're seeing play out on local government level. And so when you talk about the state-owned enterprises, there was supposed to at least be one silver lining, one example of, one good example of successful reform. And we are yet to see that. With Eskom, we saw the announcement of an electricity minister now 10 months or 9 months ago. And it's very difficult to track, what that particular intervention has led to outcomes in terms of, South Africans dealing with power outages for up to 12 to 16 hours a day. And so that disconnect from this was the intervention that the president, as the head of state and the head of the executive, has implemented. What has that paid off in terms of the outcome for how people are experiencing load shedding today, for example, or whether or not that intervention of capacitating the NPA, what does that mean in terms of actual successful prosecutions and sentences for people implicated in state capture? Because, interventions have stated objectives. You're not just making reforms just for the sake of it. There's a reason why reforms need to be implemented, and we have to judge it against outcomes. And all this while, there has been this talk that the reforms, it's too soon to judge the reforms. But when the NPA are bungling big state capture cases, one has to ask, right, what was the success story of that reform action that was put in place? And actually, what has been done in the last 5 to 6 years, measured against now real direct consequences.
Qaanitah, I want to turn your attention to the internal part of the ANC.
Sure.
We've got Ezulwini Investments, who are, of course, they have the issues with the ANC because of a marketing campaign that was done in 2019. You've got Pentuja Capital, who are, of course, accusing 4 members of the ANC. If I stand to be corrected, please do let me know. 4 ranking members of the ANC for soliciting a bribe. The ANC just internally, they're not grappling with a lot of things that are happening in the party right now. And its Secretary General Fikile Mbalula is trying to sing the right notes. I mean, he would do so as the SG of the ANC. Does the ANC still speak to the people on the ground, the people who voted for them in 1994, the people who still, to a certain extent, have a belief within the ANC that this is still a party that can carry the country forward 30 plus years? What is your assessment of them right now?
I think the ANC still has resonance in society, and that's by virtue of being the largest political party. And we have this anomaly in South Africa where, as you see decline for support for the ANC in the majority party, you are not seeing a rapid increase in support for political alternatives. And so what then happens is that people who have been disillusioned by the ANC are opting out of democracy instead of, swelling to other political parties. Now, the ANC has obviously gone through this hemorrhaging period. They believe that there has been a renewal project that has been instituted in 2017 Nasrec conference and then reignited in Nasrec 2.0 last year. But former President Thabo Mbeki asked the question, what has been done for renewal? Can you give us a real account of what is this renewal of the ANC? Because you are going to go to the electorate to say, vote for us, give us a fourth chance or a fifth chance on the premise that, because the last time around in 2019, you went to the voter and said, vote for us, we are renewing the ANC.
Yes.
But now when you go back to the voter in 2024, what are you going to say to the voter that you've done to renew the party, given the fact that people implicated in state capture have not been held accountable, as Mavusi Msimang has reminded us? And so the idea then is that, yes, the ANC will remain the largest political party even after the 2024 elections. It may not be the majority party, but it will still be the largest political party and influencing the largest, political support base. But at the same time, what you're seeing is a decline where the country is unable to withstand the consequences of bad ANC leadership and internal factionalism, like we see play out at a local government level. Not to say all problems in local government are the failures of the ANC, but the point is this, that while yes, the ANC still commands majority support in comparison to other political parties, it would be incorrect to say the ANC still has that reputation of being this broad church, of this mass mobilization movement. And I think that what the party is very good at doing is putting aside their differences and mobilizing, coming together for elections, because obviously there's so much at stake. But you will see those cracks unfold very soon when there are less positions available in provincial legislatures, when there are less positions available, when there's an internal jostling for names to be on lists for the general elections. And so what happens in the ANC definitely spills out and affects the state.
But those cracks are unfolding. It allows other parties, two other largest parties within the National Assembly, the DA and the EFF, can they pounce on potential collapsing of the ANC? Do stay tuned. I'll continue this conversation on Talking Point with Qaanitah Hunter. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm in conversation with Qaanitah Hunter. We're talking about the book, Who Will Rule South Africa, and of course, looking ahead to next year's elections. Qaanitah, let's start off, of course, with the Democratic Alliance. Statistically, they remain the main opposition towards the ANC. But how is their trajectory right now? Because obviously, it's still a party where question marks are there in terms of, especially the majority black supporters who still feel that, as much as we want to move away from the ANC, there's the perception that, okay, if the DA is the alternative, but does the DA still speak to the problems that we are having? Your assessment right now of the Democratic Alliance.
The Democratic Alliance enters the 2024 election with a very big task. That is, it has to grow its support base. Why? Because in the 2019 election, it was the first election where there was a decline in support. And in 2021, in local government election, there was a decline, but also how they couched it was that they fared better than they did in 2019 under former leader Mmusi Maimane. Now, what the DA has sought to do in the last few years is to assert itself as in terms of its political ideology and move away from it being the sort of ANC light persona that it took under the former leader Mmusi Maimane, and almost sort of stamping itself as for what it is and its policies. It elected John Steenhuisen as party leader, and then John Steenhuisen made it his mission to bring together opposition parties in an effort to unseat the ANC and also unseat a possible ANC EFF coalition. That effort was a seemingly noble one, to say let's organize opposition parties so we have one stated objective going into an election. He called it the Moonshot Pact. When the parties came together, they invited it to all political parties. South Africa has a long list of registered political parties. Last elections, over 48 parties contested the national elections. Only 14 made it to parliament. In this current formation of what's now called the multi-party charter, which is sort of led by the DA, there's only about 6 or 7 parties, of which 2 have not contested elections. And so the multi-party charter is an effort to say, let's organize together, let's come together as this bloc. And so even with really ambitious polling, this bloc, all of it together, can't pass that 40% mark, let alone reach all the way to 50% to unseat and to the ANC. That's the first thing. Secondly is there are fractions between these opposition parties, because a lot of these parties are sort of, breakaways from breakaways. Action SA is a breakaway from the Democratic Alliance. Bongani Baloyi, he's not joined the multi-party charter, but he's a breakaway from Action SA, which is a breakaway from the DA. So, you have these iterations. Now there's sort of more and more political parties coming to the scene. I understand the effort to organize the opposition. I also see it as an admission that by its own, the DA has realized that there's a ceiling to its support and that it needs other parties to effectively unseat the ANC. The prospects of what this can do, I think people are holding their breath, but it doesn't bode well for them when you see further fragmentation of the opposition in the formations of political entities like what Roger Jardine has just launched, Rise Mzansi, etc., and people not drawn to existing parties like the Democratic Alliance to unseat the ANC. Now, in terms of the flavor and character of the ANC, of the DA rather, I think that it has done well in terms of being a lot more open about what they are and what they stand for, and I think that will do the party well. But at the same time, I think that there is the real consideration that the average South African voter does not resonate, does not find expression in the Democratic Alliance. It's important that if you have a majority party that projected, say, best case scenario, the ANC declines 8 to 10%, just makes it to the 50 or just below 50% mark. Are you seeing a rise in the DA by 8 to 10%? Exactly. And that would be sort of fair analysis in comparing the two, because if anything, the DA has been given ample opportunity to, or the ANC has scored enough own goals for the DA to benefit from. But as we mentioned in the book, and it was funny for me to cite, is that there was an analyst that was quoted as saying that the DA is self-cannibalizing, unprovoked in a corner. I do think that there has to be some real reflection that as much as it is a pivotal moment for the ANC, the 2024 elections, so too will it be a pivotal moment in assessing the effectiveness of the official opposition and its ability to convince the electorate of its missions and goals.
10 years ago, the EFF was founded, Qaanitah. I mean, they've made quite a big noise. The big noise, of course, we see in the National Assembly, but also within metros and municipalities. Your assessment on the EFF now, and what sort of impact can they make in next year's polls? Because you mentioned, the ANC EFF coalition, there's a potential of that happening. I mean, just your assessment of the Red Berets and, I mean, heading into next year's elections, I mean, your take on the impact they could make.
So the EFF and Julius Malema has always had a very plain stated objective, and that is to actually take over power. And he has over the years sort of hinted and even said publicly that they'll do it by any means possible. And so you see it in terms of how they've made deals in Ekurhuleni, in eThekwini, for example. And so, but there's the second point is the ANC is facing, or the EFF rather, is facing lived reality that there could be a cap in its support, and some polls are putting it at 10%, and others are more optimistic, saying the most the party can grow to is 15%. By their own account, that takes away the ambition to run the union buildings. And so what you would then have to do is, try to be part of the party that the winning coalition agreement. And obviously, with the DA being very, very adamant that they will not form any agreement with the EFF, and they would not work with any party that works with the EFF. It obviously puts the EFF at the ANC's door. The ANC and the EFF have an agreement in Gauteng, and it's not working out very well for them. Despite they may say we're not in coalition, we're just agreeing to support each other. It's really, really not working out for them. If you look at the tension in Ekurhuleni, if you look at the tension, the West Rand in Johannesburg. And so the EFF has to, for it to make any real demand, it has to flex its muscle, it has to have a muscle.
Yes.
And so that's why it's so important for the party to grow in electoral support. I think Julius Malema focused the last few years on building party structures. I think that was very important. I think it will probably pay off for him in terms of mobilizing. He had a target of mobilizing 1 million voters.
Yes.
Obviously, the big celebration of its 10 years, it was a bold message. However, it's been 10 years of the same, or the expected actions and rhetoric from the EFF. Disruptive, some may even say fascist.
Yes.
And so, does the voter see through that? Does the voter say, do they have the same appeal to the voter as they had in 2014 when they were an interesting alternative, or in 2019 when they were voting against voters were voting against state capture and corruption. But now 10 years later, we've seen the repeated disruptions in parliament. We've seen the violence that plays out in local councils. We've seen the EFF in power in terms of, for example, being the MMC in Ekurhuleni. And that ability to not distinguish themselves too much from that ANC brand of inefficiency, but more importantly, for having that very violent characteristic in all different areas in which they operate in. And so that is going to be what they're going to be held to account by voters. And it will be interesting to see whether they fit into that predictions that their support is capped between 8 and 10%. Some people are saying 12%. Some people are saying max 15%. I do think that there is a realistic expectation from Julius Malema, even though other EFF leaders will say, we're not talking about coalitions because we are contesting to win, which is, silly. But there is this realization that, okay, we need to play our cards well because we want to be in a position of to leverage the muscle that we have in forcing the ANC if that gets to that point. There are still a lot of polls that put the ANC smack bang at 50% or just below 50%, which means they wouldn't need the EFF to govern. And and then comes the consideration of what we've mentioned in our book and a lot of talks that are happening behind the scenes of a possible grand coalition between the DA and the ANC. And that's something that was, probably unheard of 2 years ago. And the fact that it is being considered, discussed, and sort of iterations of that are being proposed behind the scenes in political circles, for me shows that anything can be possible. And I think what's important is to understand that, political parties are the voters. There's a disillusionment with the ANC, but also with politics in general. And so how much that affects the stagnation or decline of both the DA and the EFF is going to be very telling after the 2024 elections.
Grand coalitions, will that be the way ahead of next year's polls from a national perspective? We wrap up the conversation with Qaanitah Hunter after the break. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm wrapping up my conversation with Qaanitah Hunter, co-author of the book, Who Will Rule South Africa. Qaanitah, you mentioned grand coalitions. Now, we've seen in various metros across the country frustration amongst the various residents of these metros and municipalities. The fact that the squabbles within the city councils have led to there being a lack of service delivery. Now, if we're seeing that from a metro and municipality perspective, I mean, can it really, and the feasibility of it, work from a national perspective? What is your take on, it being a workable solution from a national perspective, should we get to it being in coalition government?
I don't think we have a choice. I think coalitions is exactly what voters want. So you just have to make with it with whatever voters decide. And so there isn't a thing to say whether it's good or bad. What's important is to learn the lessons from local government. And the lesson from local government is, number one, there has to be legislative reform if this has to play out almost certainly on a provincial level and possibly on a national level. There has to be some sort of a reform around how coalitions are agreed to, and the fact that there is no transparency around how parties come together and the agreements that they make are behind the scenes, and the public does not know what are the basis of those coalition agreements is absolutely problematic. The third thing is the fact that the instability comes from the fact that motions of no confidence can be called and abused. And so what happens when that plays out on a provincial and then a national level? So there has to be thinking and coming together about changing the law so that should South Africa get to that position, and it's possible that it would be, that there are mechanisms in place to propel us to the next phase of our democracy, which is where not one single party will have a grip on the majority, at least for the next while. Coalitions have in South Africa have proven to be unstable. And if we allow the status quo, as we've seen in local government play out at a national level, we are in for a disaster.
Qaanitah, when you speak to the regular citizen on the street, you talk to them about the importance of elections. And I would guess that the frustration, of course, of the lack of service delivery and so much more has led to the voter staying away from the polls and just not wanting to be involved with regards to this. Your book, for those, of course, who love reading but maybe don't want to go to the elections, I mean, how important is your book as a guide to us as South Africans exercising our democratic right to vote and allowing the citizen to have that power to make the change come next year?
I think what our book does is emphasize the message of what is at stake. This democracy was very expensive. People died for it. And so our decision then to opt out of it is a decision to hand over, and then how much of the consequences thereof can we complain about? And so the idea then is voting is the basic manifestation of democratic power. And there are other ways that we have to get involved. But the most important thing is to say the trajectory of South Africa, if people opt out from the core function of a democratic government, which is free and fair elections, then what you then have is, a free-for-all, if you like. And so the idea then is when we ask the question, who will rule South Africa? And I don't want to spoil the book, but the simple answer to that is you and I. You and I rule South Africa. And yes, it may seem lofty when you are dealing with such scenarios where, people are without water for 2 weeks, people are... The exercise in democratic process by voting is absolutely important. What's also important is that the 2024 elections is different. Because we've just had a constitutional court judgment that clarified that there has been a change to the Electoral Amendment Act. There's been an Electoral Amendment Act, which means the electoral rules have changed. You will now be getting 3 ballots. You'll be voting 1 ballot for which party is contesting the provincial elections, right? So whether you're voting for the ANC in Gauteng or in Western Cape or KZN or the DA or whatever, many parties, then you will get a ballot which is your regional to national. On that ballot will be political parties as well as independent candidates, because 200 seats of the National Assembly can be contested by independent candidates, and then you have your national your national ballot, which is political parties, and that's 200 seats. So three ballots. By the looks of it, it's going to be very long ballots because of the amount of people that are parties that have been registered and independent candidates that have raised their hand. But the reality of it is people need to understand that voting is the bare minimum. Whether this democracy survives is whether or not people want it to, and showing up to vote is the first showing that you care about this democracy and that you are participating in something that is meant for you and I.
Definitely. Qaanitah, Jazakallah so much for making the time for joining with us. Always an enlightened conversation having you, and we hope to have you soon in our studios, inshallah. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
That's all we have for you here on Talking Point. Do get this book, Who Will Rule South Africa? Really a fantastic guide on looking ahead to next year's elections and just giving you, the viewer and the citizen of South Africa, an idea of how you can exercise your democratic right come next year's elections. From myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team here from the Johannesburg studio, we'll see you again, same time, same place. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.